Hello, everyone. A warm welcome to all of our University of Michigan alumni. I am Haley Briggs, and I am the Senior Associate Director of the Alumni Education Program. Thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. As we wait for some of our attendees to join us, I'm just going to go over a few of our housekeeping notes before we get started. Again, as people are coming in, welcome. Thank you for being with us tonight. So this is an interactive webinar that is being recorded. A link to the recording will be shared in a follow-up email and will be posted to our website along with some additional resources. We can only control so much of your screen, so please feel free to make adjustments to your view using the screen separator and enable the closed captioning, which you can find at the bottom of your toolbar. The chat feature is also active tonight, and we hope you will participate in the discussion with other participants throughout the session. But because the chat section will be so active, please be sure to submit your questions for our speaker through the Q&A feature, which is also in the toolbar. After the lecture, we're going to do our very best to get to all of your questions, but it's possible we may not get to them all. And you can also, I want to note, upvote questions that you might also have or think are interesting by hitting the thumbs up in the Q&A section, and that will just help us prioritize our questions. So to kick us off in the chat, please let us know where you're joining from. I'm here in the rainy Ann Arbor, Michigan tonight with my colleagues, Kiara Trotter, our Director of our Alumni Career and Education Programs, and Brooklyn Posler, our Senior Associate Director of our Alumni Career Program. They're both helping on the back end with this Zoom. So I'm also going to launch a quick introductory poll for you all just to get your brain thinking here. So you should see that come through. Go ahead and vote on what you think the correct answer is, and we will do that while we're all joining. Great, we've got some Columbus, Ohio, California, Hawaii. Thank you for joining us. Okay, lots of answers coming through. Great, we'll give it a few more minutes. Oh, hi, Tina from Wayne. Oh, great. We've got a lot of representation here. Okay. I feel like we need some background music. Maybe we can get that for our next class session while we're voting. Okay. We might be hitting some peak poll responses, up to 84% participation. All right, well, we'll let that go a little bit longer, but I'm going to do our introduction today. I'm very happy to be here with you all, and we are very excited and very grateful to have Professor Terrence McDonald with us as we begin our first course in our Alum 101 series, which is very near and dear to my heart. And I'd like to share a little bit about Professor McDonald. So Terrence J. Terry McDonald is an Arthur F. Thurnau Professor and Professor of History in the LSA Department of History, which he joined after completing his doctorate at Stanford University. He is a prize-winning historian of the American city, has been a Guggenheim Fellow and a Fellow of the Michigan Humanities Institute, and has received almost every undergraduate teaching award conferred by the university. That's amazing. From 2002 to 2013, he served as Dean of the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, the university's liberal arts college. And from 2013 to 2022, he was the director of the university's Bentley Historical Library, which contains the archives of the university and important archives of the people and organizations of the state of Michigan, and where we are getting a lot of resources for this course. And while at the Bentley and as part of the bicentennial celebration of the university in 2017, he taught the history of the university to undergrads. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Professor McDonald to kick us off. And I'm also, and he's going to answer our poll, and I'm going to share those results right now with you all.
Yes. We decided the number was, thank you, Haley. I forgot to put that down. It it was
One.
21, I think. Am that right?
Yes.
Yep,
Yes.
21.
Mhm.
Sorry. Anyway, thank you, Haley, and thank you all for being here tonight. Forgive me for not putting that number in my notes. We'll be talking about that as we go along. Um, I think the story of how the University of Michigan became a great university in the world is actually a very impressive, important, and inspiring one. But it wasn't a topic that I naturally began to work on. That came out of an experience that I sort of want to share with you. While serving as dean of LS&A, I, of course, would go to these annual meetings of deans from around the country. And at almost every one of those meetings, someone would come up to me and say, with great confidence, we're going to be the next Michigan. I was flattered by the idea that that was an aspirational goal for another university. And I would, of course, say, well, that's wonderful or good for you. But in the back of my mind, I was always saying to myself, I don't think so. I don't think that's going to work for you. But I kept thinking, I wonder why I think that. And so, as a historian, I decided it was time to do some research into this question myself. Why is it? How did Michigan become great? How does anyone become great? How long did that greatness last? Are we still great? Why would it be harder for someone today, for example, to become the next Michigan? And so that's what led me to the topic. And along the way, I have to say that there's a lot of I hope, interesting university history involved in it. But I think it's also relevant for today because the pathways to greatness are things that are important even today, it seems to me. And so one of our concerns today might be how do we retain that greatness and continue to follow on those pathways that came out of the 19th century, actually. So with that in mind, I want to try to answer four questions tonight. And one is a question that one of you sent in. What exactly is a world-class university? That's actually it's not a very impressive answer. Okay. The second one, how highly ranked is the University of Michigan today? The third one, when did these high rankings actually begin? And then, of course, what factors produced them? Let me begin with this question of what is a world-class university, and you will be surprised and maybe even a bit disappointed to realize the answer is it's one that's ranked as one. There is no definition for a world-class university that's accepted, even by the polls that do these surveys of world-class universities. Universities are very different around the world. There are thousands of them. Some are government sponsored, some are private. Some countries don't even allow private universities, etc. So the argument is that it is the opinion of peers who are in the world-class category as to who deserves to be in that category. And so to some extent, a world-class university is one that the poll has said is so. Now, we'd like to have a much more analytic definition than that, but we don't. So we're starting, of course, just in that way by looking at a couple of rankings of the University of Michigan relevant for today. And I want to say that there's just been a new set of rankings that came out. They're not in this talk tonight because they were so new. I didn't even have time to get a chance to look at them carefully. So we're going to look at the 2024 and early 25 ones to begin with. So how highly ranked is the University of Michigan today? The answer, very high. This is the very well-known U.S. News report. If you're a parent or a grandparent of someone thinking about going to college, you may have heard about these rankings all the time. These are now, they have a status among decision-making students and their parents, very high. They were designed originally as just a money-making enterprise for U.S. News, but they've taken on a life of their own. They're very, very important in the way people think about universities in the United States today. Now, I want to begin by pointing out that this survey has 400 universities in it. So when you think about the rankings here, you could be very far down. And obviously, of course, the story I'm going to show is that the University of Michigan isn't. I think it's also important to understand the colors. So blue stands for private school. Yellow stands for a public school. And there is a difference there, and I'll explain that in a moment. So unsurprisingly, most of the top ranked universities, the top 10 or so, are going to be these private universities, many of them in the Ivy League, et cetera. And here we see the first public universities, UCLA, Berkeley, and Michigan, very closely related. So if we look at the entire group of 400 universities, Michigan is number 20, has been 24, 23, 25, 21, 21, and 21 is basically where it is right now. If, on the other hand, we look only at the public universities, it's ranked number 3, but very close to its public peers, UCLA and the University of California, Berkeley. Now, there's a very important reason for that, and that is that the U.S. News and World Report, one of its variables, its measurement variables, is the amount of money spent per student by the university. This obviously means that smaller universities have an advantage because obviously they're able to spend more money per student. Harvard University has about 7,000 undergraduate students. There are 7,000 students in the freshman class at the University of Michigan. So we are never going to be able to completely match up the expenditure per student, no matter how much money we have, simply because of scale. And that's, of course, why most of the major publics you've heard about before, California, Virginia, North Carolina, et cetera, are in the same kind of category below the rankings of the Ivy League kinds of places. Now we see a few of our Big Ten peers down here: Wisconsin 13, Ohio State 15. Uh, Respectable, but certainly not the same thing as number three, the row for Michigan there. Well, let's turn to the world now. The Times Higher Education rankings have been in existence for quite some time. They emerged from the newspaper, the London Times, which began publishing a supplement called the Times Higher Education Supplement. That then kind of went off into becoming its own magazine, and then they began doing these rankings themselves. So this has been international from the beginning. All of its rankings have included the whole world, and this includes 2,700 universities around the world. So we're talking about a very large number of universities in the world. And of course, here we see again a sort of similar pattern. The blue privates, on the whole, doing very well. The gold publics, a little bit less well, but again, the same three peer organizations: Berkeley, UCLA, and the University of Michigan. And here we are, 15, 15, 16, 18, 18. These surveys can change the variables they measure every couple of years. They do that to some extent, frankly, to mix it up a little bit. So there can be fluctuations. But basically, we're talking about out of 2,700 universities in the world that are evaluated in this survey, the University of Michigan is number 18. It's an incredibly important thing to understand how high this is, both nationally and internationally. To have the reputation of being the 18th best university in the world out of nearly 3,000 is actually quite impressive, and you could be someplace else. So, for example, let's look at the University of Virginia, somewhere between 176 and 200 in this particular one. Ohio State down there somewhere in the 90s and 100. So you could be not as distinguished. Um, um, there's obviously ways of thinking about these surveys, but nonetheless, one of the important things about this ranking is it's based on reputation. What do other universities think are the top universities in the world? And as you can see, Michigan is obviously one of them for sure. Well, the next question, because I'm a historian, is how long have U of M been ranked this high? I wanted to know, when did this start? Was it yesterday? Was it, a short time ago? And of course, it turns out it was beginning in 1908. The American almost obsession with rankings is an old one, as we all know. And this was the outcome of the first attempt to rank universities done by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. It's very, very minimal. They list the universities by the amount of money that they receive every year. And then essentially they kind of line them up according to how much money they spend per student for instruction. You see, that was the beginning of this whole idea of measuring that all the time. And you see again the ones they think were the top: Columbia, Harvard, Chicago, and there's Michigan, number four. You can see the difference in tuition for the year. By the way, those were the good old days. Columbia, $150, Harvard, 150, Chicago, 120, University of Michigan, 30. So you could get a much better deal if you came to the University of Michigan in those days. So that was so already in 1908 we're ranked among the top universities in America. Now, a scholar decided to go and look at the rankings of every university for every reputational ranking, that is, what other schools thought of them, throughout the years from 1925 to 1982. And this is the slide you're seeing right now. There's no point. We're not worrying about all the different numbers there. Once again, we're starting to see some familiar faces. The same kinds of universities are going to be in the mix here. And here's Michigan, 8854458 from 1925 to 1982. Now, it's shortly after 1982 that the U.S. News begins its surveys and starts to really, in a certain way, sort of take over the attention for these. There's a variety of ways these surveys were conducted. They were all reputational, and they were more or less systematic. The 1982 assessment was by the National Research Council, which was actually quite professional and interesting. And at that one, the university, of course, was number 8 in the country. So again, the important conclusion here is that the University of Michigan has been among the highest ranked universities in the nation and the world since 1908. It's really an impressive record, and one that we all, as current faculty members and students and alumni, should be very proud of, and realize it takes real effort and real focus for that to continue. So, of course, the next question is, how did these high ranks happen? And as I said, being a historian, I was excited to realize that the takeoff for this period was going to be earlier than I thought. It's going to be in the 19th century. And so that's where I decided to take a look and see what was going on. But I was guided to look for things in the 19th century by a very significant early 21st century book that many of you may have read for another reason, which is the book by Jim Collins called Good to Great. How does an organization go from being good to great? So his book, originally wrote a book that's been a real kind of a Bible of business thinking called Good to Great, where he looks at businesses that go from being merely good to being really great. And shortly after that, then he wrote a shorter book, a little almost like a pamphlet, on, well, how would this apply to what he calls the social sectors? In business, one way you can tell if you're getting great is if you're obviously doing well financially. Well, obviously that's irrelevant. And he says that, notice in the subtitle here, that business thinking is not the answer for nonprofit organizations in the social sector. So instead, he identified 4 things that he thought were important for those of us like universities in the social sector. Number one, powerful values that were consistently enabled. That is, that you had a set of founding values and that you measured your success by how well you were meeting those and fulfilling those values. You had visionary leadership that was able to help with that process. You discovered what it is that you do best. You weren't just imitating what other people were doing. You were doing something distinctive, and you were doing it, um, and you were committed to doing the best. And then, of course, you were simply doing it. So if you had these things and things like this, you would more likely to move to great from good. You could do perfectly good things without these, but if you had these and stuck with these, you could actually go to great. So I'm going to be looking at things like this as we look at the University of Michigan today. What were the values? What was the leadership? What did it do best? And see how that may have combined into these extremely high and distinguished rankings. So let's start with the founding values. What were the founding values of the university? And I'm relieved to say I can point them to you exactly, because here they are. Oh, wait a minute. I hope that you weren't one of those students that walked in and out of Angel Hall many, many times and didn't really look up to read the university's founding values there. I'm just giving you a hard time. The sight lines from the sidewalk in front of Angel Hall actually are very difficult. So it's very hard to see what's on top of Angel Hall, but it's important that we start there, because this actually tells us a lot about the sort of founding vision and commitment of the University of Michigan. And here's what it says up there. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary for good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. And this, of course, was the very famous phrase from the Ordinance of 1787 called the Northwest Ordinance, by which the states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin were organized. This ordinance was written by Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, of course, and it set up the educational system in each state, providing federal lands to fund the universities on down, so that education would be, from the very beginning, a factor in these states. Now, of course, it was not irrelevant that Thomas Jefferson was a founding father, and it is true that this was a connection with that revolutionary generation that the university was always going to prize and esteem and emphasize, because it really kind of gave the mission of the University of Michigan very early on, and the mission, as it were, was a derivation from the words of this founding father, Thomas Jefferson. The Northwest Ordinance, by the way, was passed before the United States existed. It was publicly passed by the Confederation in 1787. The American Constitution wasn't approved until 1789. So it's very interesting that this was one of the first things that the revolutionists wanted to see happen, and it was happening when the tide was turning and the revolution was looking good for the American side. So as far as the university was concerned, this charge meant it was up to the university to develop an understanding of the public mission and responsibility of a public university. When it was founded, there weren't very many universities, public universities in America. The university was going to have to promote equal access. The Northwest Ordinance banned slavery in the Northwest states. It was trying to begin with a situation of equality. How does a public university operate in a situation of equality? It had to be, the university had to construct religious and intellectual freedom. Most of the universities in the East, the entire Ivy League, for example, were religious schools to begin with. Some of them, in fact, were actually training ministers. The university would have to respect the rights and possibilities of all persons, and then finally to define the frontiers of education in the state, the nation, and the world. That would be the public role of the public universities in America, of which there were very few when the Northwest Ordinance was passed and when Michigan was initially founded, as many of you know, in Detroit in 1817. There were a handful of public universities. Almost all of them were private, almost all of them religiously affiliated. Now, if you'd been a student at Michigan in the 19th century, you would have spent a lot of time in this building, which is the predecessor of Angell Hall, and it was called University Hall. And you can see it's very similar in architecture. In fact, Angell Hall is built right in front of this building when it is actually built in the 1920s. And if you were going to a lecture or a concert or even a large lecture course, this is what you would see. This is the stage of University Hall. And there is the same phrase of the Northwest Ordinance on the proscenium of that stage. This was the Hill Auditorium of its day. All the major concerts, all the important lectures, all the important public events, and many, many of the academic events, including the commencements and everything else, would happen in this room. And the Northwest Ordinance would always be invoked as a reiteration of the commitment and the launching, as it were, in this really, really important way of this public university. So throughout the 19th century, you would never be far from someone talking about the influence of this on the university. And that meant that you began with a revolutionary legacy of a feeling of being connected with the generation that actually founded the United States, and have a very heavy responsibility then to fulfill this mission, which was to define the frontiers of knowledge and public access to education from then on. Now, luckily for the university in 1850, it was given a revolutionary status, and that is actually called constitutional autonomy. This was the second, if an important founding value structure was important, this is the second thing that is hugely important. It remains so today. Hopefully, it will continue in the future. What was constitutional autonomy? Well, first important to realize the state was organized and admitted the Union in 1837. By 1850, the citizens felt that it was time for a new constitution for the state, and they thought that because they felt that there was executive overreach. The governor's office had too much power, and they wanted to push that back by writing a new constitution. These were ordinary citizens elected to be delegates to the Constitutional Convention, and the Constitution was approved by vote of the people in 1850, as Michigan constitutions always have been. The theme at the institution was we don't want executive overreach, so we don't want everything in the state being settled by the governor. And the second thing was, and speakers were explicit about this, we've looked around and seen how politicians have ruined universities in some nearby states, and we don't want that to happen. So what happened was the university was given the privilege of not being under the authority of the governor or the state legislature. Instead, it would report 100% to its own regents. So the Constitution said the regents of the university and their successors shall constitute the body corporate known by the name and title of regents of the University of Michigan. They shall have general supervision of the university in the direction and control of all expenditures. They, not the state legislature, not the governor, and they shall be elected by the people to ensure the democratic mandate. And so beginning in 1850, then, this is what it was. The regents, by the way, this definition of the board is the same definition today. All of these things are the same. The election gave the regents the democratic mandate. They hold the same mandate as the governor and the state legislature. It's one of the reasons why they're not subordinate to them. They were specialized. They were not supposed to run anything but the university. But to do that, they were to have complete constitutional autonomy from the other branches of government. Someone can stand up in the state legislature and criticize the university, for example, and it's happened many times over 200 years. But the reality of what can be done by the state legislature toward the university is actually quite limited. This was an enormous grant of confidence in the university and of hope for it to develop without political interference. It was reiterated in 1963 when the state constitution not only endorsed this view, but extended it also to Wayne State and Michigan State, who became the other constitutionally protected university in the state of Michigan. Only 6 other states in the United States have a constitutional status of any kind in their constitutions for their state universities. And most of those don't have this level of autonomy that the University of Michigan. It has been crucial in the history of the university. And it's one of the things that has led to the notion of Michigan as a public ivy, because to some extent it operates independently of the state government, although with support from the state government, obviously. Now, when you think about the 19th century and you realize that times were not great in those days up until the auto industry really sort of took off. People were obviously not extremely well off. This wasn't one of the richest states for most of that time, but nonetheless, they provided substantial resources to the university. So this is starting in 1867. The university had a slice of the state property tax. And in those days, you can see that it was 1/20th of a mill, which is a thousandth of a dollar. It was not much money, $30,000. Of course, it was less expensive to run when it was tiny. And each year, that amount of money would go up a bit. There'd be money additionally for buildings, the homeopathic department, the College of Dentistry, the hospitals. And the total state appropriation then in those days was $3,668,000, which in 2020 dollars is $98 million. A tremendous commitment and sacrifice on the part of the ordinary people of the state endorsing this idea of a public university under the terms of the Constitution, which meant that they were free to set their own course for the future of the place. Now, Michigan also was very benefited, going back to the Collins idea, by visionary leaders. The first of these was the first president of the university, Henry Tappan. Tappan was a philosopher who had been teaching at Eastern universities when he was recruited to be president of the university. He came out to give his inaugural address, and it was held in a local church because that was large enough to hold the audience. There was not, when he first came, there wasn't a room large enough on the campus for him to address that many people. And he disappointed a lot of people by saying, there are no true universities in America, including this one. And that's because, as far as he was concerned, a true university had to combine research and teaching and had to have the facilities for research so that they weren't simply repeating rote knowledge, but they were actually creating new knowledge. And it was that new knowledge that would be what would be taught to the students. So the audience was a little crestfallen when it began, but they began to be enamored of his plan, which was to actually build the facilities for research on the campus. The first of these was the Detroit Observatory, opened in 1854, which, as you know, has been preserved and is still on this campus. The chemistry lab in 1858, we have a historical marker there from the American Chemical Society, testifying to its early adoption, a new medical building in 1859, and a lot of investment in the library. Here's what the Detroit Observatory looked like when it opened. There wasn't much up there. It was a pretty isolated place, and that, of course, is why they thought it would be a good place for an observatory. As some of you know, it's been beautifully preserved, and now there's a new addition on the back of it that allow you to take an elevator up into it. It's really worth a trip over to see it. The original equipment is still in the building. It's quite an extraordinary kind of a 21st century doorway into a 19th century experience if you have time to come to campus sometime and take a walk through it. Now, the university also did something quite extraordinary, which was establish a commitment to diversity very early on in its history. And this happened in 1870 already. So there had been a great deal of agitation in the state on the part of women and, of course, wives in particular and their husbands who were the voters. Keep in mind it was an all male, all white male suffrage in those days. By 1870, it was racially mixed, but it was all men. And so the idea was the women were concerned that their daughters couldn't go to the university, and there was a lot of agitation toward opening up the university. It was all male from the beginning. And so the regents actually decided, with a split vote, it wasn't unanimous, to open the door to anyone. And they didn't want to be specific about what group might be admitted. And so what they wrote was this, that the board recognizes the right of every resident of Michigan to the enjoyment of the privileges afforded by the university, and that no rule exists in any of the university statutes for the exclusion of any person from the university who possesses the requisite literary and moral qualifications. This, for 1870, was quite remarkable. It permitted the admission of women, of course, but also African American students. And it meant that basically LS&A, for example, would be 30% women, female, by the turn of the 20th century. Not only that, every program in the university was opened to women, and for that matter, all those of other backgrounds as well, so that you could apply to the law school, to the medical school, later on to the engineering school, regardless of your background. So this was the really extraordinarily early. Now, keep in mind, women, for example, were not going to the Ivy League until the 1860s, until the 1960s. African Americans were there really only in the 1960s. This was 100 years in advance of thinking in the 20th century, and it sent the message that knowledge was open to all, and that there was going to be no distinction based on background to prevent someone coming to the University of Michigan. It was going to be this statute already in place in 1870 that was going to prevent the adoption of a Jewish quota on Jewish students in the 1920s. There has never been a quota on Jewish students, undergraduate Jewish students at the university. And in part, it's because of this resolution that was passed in the 1870s, which prevented it. This was actually quite a statement. And it was somewhat controversial at the time when people thought, oh, mixing male and female students and white and colored students, white and African American students could be a problem. But in fact, it turned out to be, it all worked out to be fine. If you lived in Stockwell Hall, you might want to see Madeline Stockwell, who was the first woman who came to the university. She was admitted as a sophomore in 1870 and graduated with the class of 1872. About that same time, then, we had our second visionary leader, James B. Angell. Angell was a long serving president, the longest in the history of the university, president from 1871 to 1909. In those days, there was no bureaucracy around the president, and the president personally approved the admission of every student and hired every faculty member. That was a big job. Um, so Angell did this, which meant that he selected all the faculty. There were 285 of them by the time he came to the end of his term in 1908. He approved the founding of the graduate school in 1892, which meant the university would be able to um, produce students with the PhD. And he grew the enrollment of the university from 1,100 to about 5,300 by the end of his term, making it one of the largest universities in America at that time. It was under Angell that Michigan really began to fit into this new model of research universities in which all the faculty would have PhDs, all the faculty would be doing research in their fields, and the teaching of the students would be entirely based on the research of the faculty, or significantly based on the research of the faculty. Um, Tappan had the vision of that happening, but in fact, it wasn't until Angell that the disciplines began to produce people like this. And he was very smart and hired many of the leading figures of the disciplines under his presidency. And here's three of them that became very important. The middle person there is John Dewey, probably the most famous philosopher in American history, inventor of the field of pragmatism, as many of you know. Well, he began his academic career here in 1884 and spent his first 10 years as an academic at the University of Michigan. When we run into him in undergraduate courses, we normally see a gray-haired old man, but in fact, when he came here, he was very young, and this is what John Dewey looked like. On his I think it's either right or left from your screen, is Henry Carter Adams. He was one of the leading economists of his day, the founder of our economics department, and in the 1920s, the actual founder of our business school. He was the first statistician of the Interstate Commerce Commission, very, very significant in his day. And this is Frederick Novi, the widely recognized father of American bacteriology, who got both his PhD and his MD here at Michigan, and then stayed on the faculty and made major, major research grants and, of course, research breakthroughs. And then, of course, we're teaching graduate and undergraduate students the whole time that he was here, especially medical students in the medical school. So it was people like this that began to populate the university in the 1890s. They were the leaders of their fields. That's what Angel was looking for, was to hire young leaders of their fields who would shape the face of academic life, both on the campus. By the way, all three of these people were also great teachers. They were great undergraduate teachers at the same time. And so this was the kind of person that he wanted to have here, and this was going to set off this idea of a kind of a recapitulation of this decision making all the way through the rest of its history. Now, I need to say the one place where Michigan fell down, it was revolutionary in admitting women, for example, to study, but it would not hire women on the faculty. So many women would come here, get their PhDs, but then go elsewhere and be on the faculty, but they would never be hired at the University of Michigan. And that was a mistake, honestly, until really quite a ways through the 20th century before that was a common thing. And even after that, there was some resistance and some failure to understand how that should happen. Well, President Angel's crowning achievement, really, and from the standpoint of the future of the university, not only of Michigan, but of other universities, happened in 1900 when he was invited to a meeting by the presidents of the University of Chicago, Columbia, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and the University of California, Berkeley. Here again, we're seeing those names, the peer names that we've been associated with. And the idea was to set up an organization that would rationalize and define graduate education in America. And by doing that, to help really birth and empower the research university in America. It was enormously significant that Michigan was included in this. There were originally 11 private members, once again, familiar names, 3 public. Berkeley was one, Michigan was one. And these were the leading universities then, and most still are. The Association of American Universities, which is what came out of this meeting, still exists. It's highly regarded as the most research intensive and distinguished universities in America. And there are about 60 members, very, very limited membership, very difficult to become a member. For a period of time, just a few years ago, our former president, Mary Sue Coleman, was the leader of this association. So we have close connection. We've had close connection with this organization more recently, too. But the most important thing was this was almost a designation of the leading universities in America in those days, those who were invited to belong to this. And Michigan was not only invited, but was invited to be one of the founders of the organization itself. So these then were the pathways to greatness. As I said, all in the 19th century, the university had revolutionary founding values. It was constantly aware of its connection with the founding fathers and their revolutionary aspirations for democratic education. It had what we now think of as a revolutionary status, unique, almost unique even today. Constitutional autonomy has been the keystone of its ability to develop under its own steam rather than taking orders from the political sector. It's had substantial state support. It had already through the 19th century. It was lucky to have visionary leadership, some of which has been continued up to the present. It had a commitment to diversity from the very beginning. No particular group with a particular background was in control of knowledge. The doors were open. Now, it didn't mean it was easy for those students when they came. When students of color came, when women came, when immigrant children came, they had to make their own way in the university. It was only a very modern idea that the institution should change to accommodate newcomers. In those days, it was, you're welcome to be here, but then you're on your own. Women had a hard time finding a place to live, believe it or not. Many boarding house owners didn't want to rent to women. They wanted to rent to men. African American students had a terrible time finding housing. Luckily, there was just enough of an African American community to help them with boarding house residents there. And there was the same kind of, Michigan was a hotbed of anti-Semitism, the state of Michigan, not the university. when Jewish students began to come in the 20s and 30s. And once again, there certainly was prejudice against some of those students um, about in the area, not in the classroom for the most part. So it wasn't easy, but nonetheless, the door was open and many people began to recognize it, in particular, quite frankly, many of those who were barred from being in other universities based on their sex, their race, or their religious affiliation, for example. And then the university discovered this central mission. It was going to be open, as we've seen with this commitment to diversity. It was going to be dedicated to advancing the frontiers of knowledge, not simply repeating knowledge that had been produced by others. And it was going to teach students that knowledge right from the frontier, right from the lab, right from the library, right from the observatory, right to the students. The students, in many cases, were going to be there when that knowledge was being formed, and that was going to put them in a completely different place in society when they actually finished this as well. Now, our friend Jim Collins has a way of kind of summarizing this, and some of you may remember this. It's called the flywheel effect. All right. I mean, so basically, you get a momentum going. That's why he calls it the flywheel effect. You start off by getting the right people there. You discover your focus on what he calls the hedgehog compass, which is what's the thing that we do best. And then you begin to demonstrate results. People begin to hear about how good you are. You attract people who believe in you, maybe contribute time, maybe contribute money, and the strength grows and grows and grows. And greatness grows from the moving of this flywheel. That is the momentum that's generated by these kind of founding conditions that push an organization in the right direction toward greatness. And this is exactly what happened to Michigan early on in its history, certainly, but it's been a continuous process and one that we should all recognize, in my view, and be very proud of. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Professor McDonald. I have to admit I was one of those students who walked many times through Angel Hall and did not look up. So thank you for pointing that out. And the next time I'm walking by, I will certainly look at that. So we are going to jump right into our questions. Again, we received a number of questions in advance in the Q&A. A reminder to put those in the actual Q&A section, which is in your toolbar, so we can see them. And okay, we're gonna dig right in and see how many we can get to. So I want to focus a little bit on the future. So you got us to today, and so this question was submitted in advance, and it reads: How will U of M maintain its status as a world-class institution, and what threats do you see for the university in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, so I think one thing we can do is just read right back, right? I mean, so essentially, um, the preconditions for success, what led to this kind of flywheel effect, as it um, were values. We certainly still have those values, although obviously there's a little bit of contention over that these days around us, not necessarily on the campus. We still have constitutional autonomy, although again, there are some dangers there. In this case, from interference from the federal government rather than from the state government. We have had continuous state support. It hasn't been as high as it might have been in the past a little bit. We have visionary leadership. We have a commitment to diversity, and we have a tremendous, furious commitment, deep commitment to the central mission. So, I mean, I think some of the most important things in the future will have to do with number one, constitutional autonomy. Can we continue to make our own way, as a university should, in the role, or will there be interference, maybe even interference that reduces support, for example, for research or teaching that might come from the federal government? This is a real serious issue, I think, going forward. Um, will we, in a sense, be clear on what we're doing? I think there's been some confusion about how important it is, for example, to make it clear that the doors are open to people to succeed, regardless of background. There's a lot of controversy over it these days, but the idea that from the very beginning, our view was no one owns knowledge, and to find the frontiers of knowledge, you have to open the doors to everyone, and then later, when we realized you need to make it possible for those people to succeed when they arrive. I think this is very important. It's also turning out to be a somewhat embattled concept these days. So I think there is some of these things are actually a little bit uh, under threat. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens over the next few years. I want to say the commitment to the mission, the understanding of the mission, the visionary leadership, these are all obviously very present. The idea of a place that does knowledge production and the teaching of that knowledge is firmly embedded in the faculty. So in many ways, the base of this is fine, but the environment around it has a tendency to shift over time as it does. And that's where there's a little more potential danger.
That's great. And I believe that we have another question in the Q&A submitted while you were presenting that leads into this a little bit as well. And you've already touched on it, but it was, what are your thoughts on what greatness looks like? So you've identified, I think, the keys to the previous historical greatness. Is there anything else besides revisiting these that you might add to when you think about, what does greatness look like in the future for the university?
Uh, so as you know, when I was dean of LS&A, I used to say to parents and students, if the university is doing exactly what you want all the time, it's not a very good university. Universities are designed to push the frontiers. That is, we're always pushing, pushing, pushing. We're discovering new ways to do things, new ways to cure disease, new ways to define concepts, new ways to act with one another from the social sciences, for example. So universities are always a little bit ahead of the let's call it the normal curve. We are sometimes thought to be on the extreme of things, but in reality, that's kind of our job, is to move forward and to sometimes antagonize people. Wait a minute, what are they doing? A funny example of this, when President Angel came, and this is 1870. Up until 1870, there was evangelical Protestant chapel on the campus every single day, and there was a chapel built in University Hall. And he arrived, and he said, "Required chapel doesn't mean a thing. We're done with it." Whoa. There was a huge uproar in the state. This was 1870, 1871, don't forget, because he had taken this stance that there would no longer be required chapel at the University of Michigan. Well, you could have asked, should there have been to begin with, because of course it was a public university after all. But that idea that universities will from time to time make decisions on their own because they have autonomy to do it, that will sort of sometimes kind of antagonize people. It's kind of their job. And so I think that that's something we need to kind of remind ourselves from time to time, that that's the role they play. And by the way, that's why the people in 1850, we're not talking about 1950, in 1850, we don't want people in politics telling universities what to do. We want the universities to manage their own affairs. That was a pretty radical thing. And I think that's kind of what we want to think about today. And recognize then that we won't always agree with what universities are doing, not this one. But we will understand that's part of their job, is to be sometimes a little bit different from us, a little bit ahead of us in what they do and teach.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so our next question we got was asked in advance by several people in several different ways. And so this was, how might athletics have impacted rankings?
Yeah, so as you can see, uh, I'm talking about the sort of the academic rankings, but of course, in part that's because there weren't very many athletic rankings. I'm talking about academic rankings, there weren't very many athletic rankings. So in reality, they didn't have much effect on this at all, and there was a very good reason for that. Because up until 1909 or so, 1908, 1909, athletics were basically almost like a bunch of little private businesses on the campus. They were organized by students, and they would organize the competition, and there was very little regulation of these things. In fact, the university didn't really have any control over them. There were things that happened. There was cheating. There was rule violation. There were guys that used to go around from team to team and play with a bunch of different teams in the same season, and all kinds of things happening. And it really was not until after this that the university got involved, and the board of control was organized by the university in 1908, 1909, and that's when the university began to sort of supervise athletics. But at that time, the whole field was very, very mixed up. And so in reality, things were, there was a lot of criticism of athletics. It was thought to be corrupt. It was thought to be rough, too rough. So to some extent, the image of athletics, ironically, wasn't always a positive one at the turn of the 20th century. And it was going to be quite some time after that when things got kind of normalized. And all of a sudden, then you had a Big Ten conference, and you knew who stood where, and it might have made a difference. Athletics today makes a very significant difference, not surprisingly, in the public knowledge of the University of Michigan and in at the admission figures. So when university teams do well, the number of students who apply goes up almost always.
Hmm.
So there's a publicity factor that is very, very important. Um, and it doesn't have an effect, as you can imagine, keeping in mind that many of the people doing the rankings are a little more on the academic side than, than on
Yeah.
the athletic side too.
Yes. Okay, that's great. We have another question about admissions. And so, in the early decades of the university, was there management of in-state versus out-of-state admissions?
No, the in fact, one of the frustrating things for historians, frankly, that we discovered at the Bentley is that there really wasn't a lot of tracking of admissions at all until pretty much the second or third decade of the 20th century. So we don't really no one was paying much attention. Now, it's an important fact about the University of Michigan in these years, the years I'm talking about, there were no dormitories,
Hmm.
none. So there was no need to worry about how many beds do we have for the students because there weren't any. So basically, Tappan had decided that the university building should be used for teaching and research and not for residences. And so he eliminated the dormitories. Now, keep in mind, that's way back in the 1850s. So for the rest of the 19th century and early 20th century, there were no dormitories. So there was no constraint on the size of the university. If you could get admitted and find a place to live in Ann Arbor, you could come to the university. That being the case, um, the, uh, the record keeping was actually pretty flimsy, and then the university adopted the position that anyone who graduated from an accredited high school in Michigan was admitted as admissible, and that made a difference too. So really, there was almost no monitoring of in-state versus out-of-state. We'd like to know how many students were in-state and out-of-state in so many years. It's very hard to find out. And so it didn't make a big difference for most of that time. The majority of students, people are assuming, were in-state for a lot of reasons. But it does turn out that there was a substantial out-of-state constituency. One interesting one that many of us only learned about somewhat recently was that the universities in the South were destroyed in the Civil War. And so right after the war, a lot of people from the South began coming up. They may have been the first big block of out-of-state students were Southern students who came up because universities had been destroyed in the South during the war.
Hmm. Okay, this question got quite a bit of upvoting, and it's again kind of thinking towards current events in the future. But if you could share your thoughts on some of that constitutional autonomy and attacks on other universities and cutting funding and what the university might be able to do to overcome some of that in the future.
So I think it's important to talk a little about. So let me first say that I mean I think if you were to say to me of everything on that list, what's the most important thing that was a pathway to greatness? I mean, there are two of them. I think one is the founding values. I think it means something to be, honestly, to me as a faculty member and everyone I know like that, to be a faculty member at a leading public university is very special, and it means something special. So it's not the same thing as being at a place. Even you might say, well, there's tremendous status in the Ivy League, but the mission of being at a very, very high quality public university is very appealing to faculty members. And I want to say that I think that's really important. So those founding values and that perspective are really important. But the next most important thing, obviously, is constitutional autonomy. As I've said, universities always exist in a sense of a little bit of tension with society. They are frequently on the kind of leading edge of things. This may be scientifically. For example, is AI going to take over the world? Well, a lot of that research, of course, is university-based research. Is
Mhm.
that dangerous? Is it terrible? Is it going to increase knowledge? Well, of course, the universities think it's on the whole, it's a pretty good thing. It's going to increase our ability to think about things all the time. Certain kinds of medical research are worrisome. Are we going to do? You saw recently that a child was saved by gene editing. That was enormously controversial when it first was produced through university-based research. So universities are pushing things out there. They sometimes then cause these issues. They need to have the autonomy and the independence to do that. And so any threat to autonomy of universities, quite frankly, is, I think, very, very dangerous. The partnership between the universities and the federal government is an old one. It began right after World War II. And the lesson of World War II was we needed to be constantly doing research to stay on top of all kinds of developments around the world. that might be good, that might be bad, whatever. And so the idea of the federal government, not the universities, ironically, was we're going to have a partnership with universities. We're going to support universities to do this research. And that's going to do two things. It's going to help the students who want to go to those universities because we're supporting them financially. And it's going to make the research cutting edge research because that's what the universities do. This was the basis of the university partnership, which actually began after World War II. It's been in place ever since.
Mm.
So it's very important to understand that. When people say, we're not going to have this, we're going to eliminate this, and in particular, we're going to stop this if you're not doing what we want, that's breaking with a tradition that goes back to 1947, 1949, what have you, and has been hugely important in the history of all universities in America, by the way. There's 125 research universities in America today. Uh, we're at the top of that list. But many universities in many states are in this partnership with the federal government and depend on it. And the idea that this is going to stop or be put into a kind of a political test, I think is obviously going to be very bad for universities. And so that's something that people have to figure out. In our case, it's very interesting. So we have complete autonomy from the state government. Do we have it from the federal government? Well, that's a kind of a legal question, probably not. But nonetheless, it's worth remembering that constitutional autonomy for the Board of Regents is not just kind of something that happened in 1850. It's a commitment that the regions, this seems to me, need to think about and make. This is what we do. This is where we stand. This is why we've been great because we have this autonomy. I think that's something very valuable for us to think about and reiterate from time to time, even in the present kind of difficult circumstances.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Okay, I think this is our final question because we're almost at the top of the hour, and I think it concludes your talk quite well. But it says if 1817 is the university's founding, what year would you say U of M got its footing or became the institution we know and love today?
Well, let me just quickly tell you, by the way, that there's been, especially among alums, a lot of controversy over, when was the founding, and
Yeah.
during the bicentennial, there was a lot of conversation about this. So, the university legally, actually, begins in 1817. It really doesn't get its footing until it gets into Ann Arbor, and it comes to Ann Arbor. The state is organized in 1837, and the first classes at the university are in 1841 in Ann Arbor on the Diag, and that's the beginning. I think that's really the place where that kind of begins. But the first instructors at the university were all local ministers. And of course, in those days, most of the people who went to college were ministers. There weren't very many that went to college. But they weren't trained to really do anything in their disciplines, and they weren't even sure what the disciplines were. It was a very small faculty, very small student body. So I think it's the arrival of Tappan is the
Mm.
beginning of this whole thing. Tappan has a vision of where the university has to go. He begins building the facilities that will make it go. He's then gets into an argument with the regents during the Civil War, and then he's eliminated, unfortunately. And then there's kind of a break, and then Angel, of course, comes in and does it. So I would say that, by the 1880s, we are pretty much on the track that we need to be on. But it wasn't irrelevant that we had a very far-seeing president before then, President Tappan, who had this vision and definition of where the university should go. Angel's ability to execute this vision is crucial, I think. But I would have said by then we were on the track, and in part, frankly, because of the people he was hiring and what they were teaching and those kinds of things as well.
Okay, I feel like that's a good segue into my my wrap up here. Let me just share my screen quickly. So I'm going to highlight our next class, our next session, which is next Wednesday night at, let me just get this up here at 6 p.m. again. So same time, same place next week. And I also want to highlight we have an in-person optional field trip. The space is very limited for that, and we'll have more information tomorrow, but that's going to act as a capstone for the course. And it's going to include stopping by the Alumni Center, seeing our notable alumni wall, taking a tour of campus. We're going to see Angel Hall. We're going to see a lot of the places that Professor McDonald touched on. The Tappan Oak sapling that was saved and grown by an alum has been replanted near the Alumni Center, so you can visit that. It'll be a lot of tie-ins to the course, so I want to highlight that as well. And just thank you again, Professor McDonald. It was a pleasure having you, and we just appreciate you sharing your expertise and your time with us all. And we hope to see you all next next week when class is in session again. So I think that's all of my reminders, except that we will be sending an email tomorrow with the recording, with the additional resources that Professor McDonald has shared to continue your learning in advance of next week. Thank you all for being with us this evening. Thank you again, Professor McDonald, for kicking us off our first ever Alum 101 class session. Thank you, and go blue.